You and they are not the same. They live under a different sky. They eat better, live better, and even die better.
You know who invented salad? Poor people.
The poor experience a different world. They experience different stores, different commutes, different things that they do with their time off. The air they breathe is not the same.
You smell that? What is that?
What?
What's that smell?
Opportunity.
No, money.
Oh, okay.
They fear different things. Even their dreams are different. The rich dream of success while the poor dream only of survival. So how do two groups of people who often occupy the same space live such drastically different lives? Chapter 1: Extraction and Exploitation. Socio-economic polarization has always been a feature in human society, primarily driven by exploitation. In order to understand the history of exploitation, we have to understand the history of value extraction. Throughout history, the powerful few have always exploited the powerless many. This is not an interesting observation, but it needs to be said to set the stage for what I am going to explore. Slaves would be captured in war, or some would be born slaves and remain so their entire lives. In feudal societies, serfdom flourished, whereby serfs, people tied to a land, would toil on said land for their lords. They would keep whatever they needed to subsist and surrender everything else that they produced to their lords. This is essentially like a very steep regressive tax, where the poor have to pay 70 or 80 or even 90% tax to the rich. Their children would be born to serfs and live and die as serfs. Slavery was worse. The slave would essentially pay 100% tax to the rich and have no human rights, let alone workers' rights. They were valued solely for their labor potential. As most of the enlightened European countries banned slavery over the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, they needed a new source of labor. Enter colonialism. As slavery was gradually abolished with one hand, the empires continued to colonize developing regions with the other. Colonialism was very extractive. Poorly paid laborers would toil and extract resources or grow commodities like sugar and spices and ship them off to the West. This can be thought of as a very high tax paid by the colony to the imperialist power. The European colonial system broke down in the late 19th and early 20th century, and empires contracted. In the 20th century, the faded colonial powers, along with an ascendant United States, backed coups around the world to install autocrats who could be controlled. One of the most notorious examples being the overthrow of the secular and democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh in favor of strengthening the autocratic rule of the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. This attitude remains undiminished. The United States continues to provide billions in arms sales to the repressive Gulf monarchies in order to stabilize crude prices. The United States had even at one point in its history supported the regime of Saddam Hussein before falling out. And speaking of Middle Eastern countries, while the Arab petro-economies in the region rely on exporting their only resource, they in turn import vast armies of low-skilled labor and underpaid laborers from South and Southeast Asia to work on everything from construction to service sector jobs. Large proportions of their populations are non-nationals with no possibility of obtaining citizenship, truly a servant class. Remember, these are not countries that have fertility rate or demographic issues. They simply need others to serve them. The exploitation can be largely attributed to the kafala system, which is a set of laws and policies that place the responsibility for migrant workers onto their employers, who are able to control their ability to enter, reside, work, and exit the host country. Does that remind you of anything? 150 years after the East India Company had been dissolved, Western companies are now extracting valuable minerals from the lands run by autocrats, where most of the value from such deals accrue to the ruling classes. The value extraction continues by another name: colonialism disguised as international trade. Chapter 2: Wage Suppression and Atomization. We have been talking about exploitations between countries and peoples, but it is alive and well within the borders of countries themselves. In China, wages have been artificially suppressed to the point where its well-educated labor force cannot find jobs that suit them. But you might be wondering how companies can circumvent the relatively superior workers' rights that are prevalent in developing countries. Well, let me introduce you to independent contractors. This is perhaps the biggest innovation for wage suppression. Work for yourself, be your own boss, take control of your own time. These catchphrases, while ostensibly empowering, are a tool being used to pay people below minimum wage legally. Yes, you can be your own boss, but only at a failing company. Business owners do not earn minimum wage. If your business is not doing well, you could technically have zero income or even in negative income, meaning you'd have to dip into your savings or take on debt. And within the gig economy space, you may very likely make less than minimum wage. The atomization of labor continues with gig work, where instead of a stable job with predictable hours, fragmentary units of labor can be bought and sold. Sites such as Fiverr, Upwork, and TaskRabbit allow people to offer services piecemeal. While these sites can no doubt help individuals earn additional income, increasingly people are relying on them to fully support themselves. While gig workers form a servant class to cater to the needs of the rich, away from urban areas we see the rise of temporary foreign workers. Companies lobby the government to flood the labor market by importing large numbers of unskilled labor, which serves to curtail wage growth. They often live in substandard homes provided by the company and are beholden to their employer due to closed work permits. And this creates an asymmetry of power that leads to exploitation. Does that remind you of something? Not unlike the foreign workers in Saudi Arabia, these temporary foreign workers live and work in dreadful conditions. In Dubai, the lowly paid workers are ferried from faraway slums to work on the majestic buildings in the city. But they cannot dream of living in the towers that they build. After their workday is done, they are shuttled back to their slums out of sight. They do not make enough to even patronize the shops and restaurants in the city, so they have their own stores and their own restaurants. The temporary foreign workers do the work but must not be seen. They are segregated, not unlike the servant class that catered to the whims of the aristocracy in Britain, living downstairs. Similar to the many foreign workers that live away from cities harvesting the food we eat, we do not see them, only the fruits of their labor. Chapter 3: Two Households Unlike in Dignity. The following section will contain spoilers for the movie Parasite. In Bong Joon-ho's 2019 masterpiece, Parasite, spaces are used to depict social standing. The poor family of the Kims live in a liminal space, in what is called a semi-basement. They are not fully underground, but not above the ground either. Their window is truncated, allowing little light. The light is the promise of something greater. Their eventual employer, the Park family, is wealthy, and their home abounds with large windows and spacious rooms that are bathed with light. Finally, the invisible husband of the former housekeeper, a man forsaken by society, is relegated to a lightless underground realm deep beneath the home, the existence of which even the owners are not aware of. It is from here that the husband continues to serve the Parks. And not unlike the serfs who would be bound to the land, it is suggested that the supplanted housekeeper also, quote-unquote, came with the house.
그리고 그 집 사람들 통틀어서 그 집에서 제일 오래 산 것도 그 여자야.
입주인은 바뀌었는데 가정부는 안 바뀐 케이스구만.
We also see that what is a gentle rain that the park's sun delights and plays in picks up force as it flows downward physically and socially to become a deluge of destruction for the Kim family. The same random natural phenomenon has vastly different impacts for the rich and the poor. Wealth can dull the edge of bad luck. Getting unlucky while poor can be ruinous. At the conclusion of the film, the father of the poor Kim family takes the place of the previous occupant of the dark basement. What is interesting is the Kim's son dreams of being able to climb out of his semi-basement and one day purchase the large, airy upper-class house of the Parks, which is impossible. Instead of challenging the structure of society, he sees it as immutable and wants to use it to realize his false hopes. The improbable fantasy of ascending the class ladder keeps people working. A few make it, but many do not, and this is truer now than in the decades before. The utilidor system in Walt Disney World's Magic Kingdom in Florida is a system of underground tunnels under the park that are used by the Disney cast members to perform support operations. While these tunnels undeniably have a lot of practical utility, such as allowing cast members to move across the park efficiently and allowing for waste removal, deliveries, food service, and other support operations, I cannot ignore the symbolism this system represents. A servant class that is relegated to the subterranean and can only emerge not as themselves but as sanitized fictional characters to serve and entertain the guests.
야, 이거 진짜 상징적인 거네.
They're not real when they're on the surface, only when underground. On the surface, they are stripped of humanity and reduced to pure labor. The real employees move around unseen. This model pervades through our everyday. Cars pick us up and drop us off, driven by interchangeable drivers with whom we barely need to communicate. Packages and food may appear on our porch. Food gets delivered to supermarkets. Buildings rise in the desert. But we seldom see the ugliness of the process behind it, the long hours, the low pay, and when we do, we often ignore it. And this underclass is expanding. Increasingly, the cities are becoming places for only the rich. Along with gentrification, the land-owning class uses NIMBYism to make sure there's a limited supply of housing that drives up its price and prices out the poor. A lot of people with median wages in urban centers cannot afford to live where they work and must commute from far away to get to their low-wage jobs that involve catering to the rich. And it doesn't end there. Because the poor live away in poorer regions, their schools are poorly funded and lead to poorer educational outcomes. Poorer educational outcomes are correlated with poorer health. Increasingly, higher education has become a status symbol, and if the poor want to access the types of jobs higher education offers, they risk being saddled with student debt that can follow them their entire life. Not dissimilar from indentured servitude. Despite occupying the same space, the rich and poor become immiscible like oil and water. They eat different food, they go to different schools, they play different games. Poverty, therefore, becomes a heritable disease, and this lack of social mobility is the key to sustaining a large servant class. Before we move on to the next chapter, if you're enjoying the video, please support me for free by liking, commenting, and subscribing. Thank you. Let's move on. Chapter 4: The New Lords. I want you to think about how a future trillionaire might spend his money. The rich are not only moving away from the average economically, but also geographically. Can a future trillionaire buy his own country and populate that country not with citizens but servants and employees, people who have no connection to a piece of land despite working there? Larry Ellison owns 98% of Lanai Island. Mark Zuckerberg is building a not-so-secret $270 million compound in Kauai, complete with an underground bunker. Peter Thiel wanted to build a bunker-like lodge in New Zealand, but was denied permits. Perhaps they know something we do not. Perhaps they understand that society cannot continue on this path, one where value is increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few. The capital that accumulates does not feed back into the system, as those with money and consequently power are able to shape laws to favor them. Low taxes means wealth accumulates at the top and does not recirculate into the economy. The rich buy more capital, which has a much higher return than labor. An increasingly top-heavy wealth distribution is unstable and will inevitably topple. And the world following that collapse is a world no one can imagine. Perhaps that is why these billionaires are buying up unassailable sanctuaries surrounded by water that produce food and power independently. They are buying up assets that will have value even after a complete social or economic collapse, such as farms and livestock. We have come full circle then, from being at the mercy of monarchs to then serving colonial masters, and then graduating to serving the multinational corporations, and now finally we serve at the feet of multi-billionaires, the new royalty. Chapter 5: The Last Death of Labor. The final step is to do away with labor altogether. Labor has always been a pesky thorn on the side of capital, a necessary evil, always whining about sick days, workers' rights, lunch breaks, workplace safety, weekends, vacation time, fair pay, and healthcare. While labor-saving innovations have led to great improvements in quality of life, we are nearing a point where companies may be successful at eliminating most labor altogether. And thus, after a centuries-long battle, labor may finally be defeated. AI technology, while comically nascent now, when extrapolated into the next few decades, shows us a world where creativity and innovation are no longer the preserve of man. Previously, with the automation of factories and manufacturing processes, jobs could migrate into white-collar work. But what happens when AI can design, write great poems, compose great music, and invent new solutions? And on the low end, automatons can fix your plumbing, do your chores, and cook your food. Finally then, the dream of pure labor will be realized. Labor that is tireless, voiceless, and without humanity. Where will human labor go? Chapter 6: An Unoriginal and Obvious Solution. Of course there will be new jobs created, but I suspect that for every job created, many more will be made obsolete, which will exacerbate inequalities. There is only one solution to this problem. We know that the return on capital tends to be much higher than the growth rate of the economy, so capital will always tend to pool at the top. Those who have wealth will be able to grow it. If you liken capital and wealth facilitating transactions and innovations in the economy to the blood in one's body, then it is as if, with every beat of the heart and every go around the circulatory system, a little bit of the blood is accumulating in the skull. Eventually, the body is deprived of blood, so more blood needs to be produced. As capital accumulates, it does not circulate through the economy efficiently. The rich have a lower marginal propensity to consume, and buying billion-dollar yachts or private islands and employing armies of poorly paid labor does not help the domestic economy significantly. So just as with the blood in the body analogy, more money needs to be produced, which is done through debt. The yawning gap between tax revenues and government expenditures shows up as increasing debt to GDP ratios of countries. Debt sustains consumption, and consumption means more money flows into the coffers of corporations and the pockets of people who own them. So essentially, the government is printing money to indirectly pay the corporations. Without increasing levels of debt to stimulate the economy, consumption would fall, and company revenues would fall, and stock prices would follow. This happened before during the Great Depression. If hyperinflation is caused by a country printing too much money, the Great Depression was because the country didn't print enough. They couldn't, since the currency was backed by gold. To say that the consequence was disastrous would be an understatement. So what is the solution to the accumulation of capital at the top and the bifurcation of society? What I'm about to say is not novel, but I hope everything I've said so far gives context as to why. The solution is higher taxes. We need to take a portion of the capital that accumulates at the top and have it recirculate back into the system. This way, we do not need to keep printing money to stimulate the economy and prevent deflation. And this is in fact one of the issues about universal basic income, UBI, that few people talk about. In a future where large swaths of the population is underemployed or unemployed, UBI sounds like a panacea.
There will be fewer and fewer jobs that a robot cannot do better. What to do about mass unemployment? This is going to be a massive social challenge. And I think ultimately we will have to have some kind of universal basic income. I don't think we're going to have a choice.
But if UBI is financed through taking on debt, then essentially we have the government creating money that eventually finds its way into the pockets of corporations and their owners. This is why UBI has a lot of traction in tech bro circles, but strangely enough, high corporate taxes and wealth taxes do not. They know that when labor becomes obsolete, there will be no one with money to buy their products. So according to the ultra-rich, giving money to the people is a great idea as long as that money is not funded through higher taxes. This brings to mind Henry Ford, who famously paid his workers double the average wage at that time, not out of a sense of magnanimity, but so his workers would make enough to buy his cars. Which is not so different than a company paying a higher tax that eventually finds its way to its employees. There are valid concerns about large government. Large governments tend to be inefficient and mired in bureaucracy, and more money might mean more corruption. But simply dispersing the money to the bottom quartile, quintile, or decile of people by income and wealth should eliminate the middleman and stimulate the economy much more efficiently and reduce the bifurcation of society. No revolution necessary. Looking at a list of countries by social mobility, one can observe a significant overlap with a list of countries by personal income tax. But we can do better and go further. Wealth taxes, which admittedly are difficult to implement and is beyond the scope of this video, and greater inheritance taxes can moderate the accretion of wealth across generations. This is not a radical idea. Between 1936 and 1963, the top individual tax rate in the United States generally ranged between 80 and 90%, and the top corporate tax rate reached a high of 53% in 1968 to 1969. Between 1936 and 1963, the stock market grew by almost 10 times adjusted for inflation and including dividends. The US GDP grew by 300% or 4 times during this period. Between 1948 and 1985, the corporate tax rate was over 40% with a peak of 53%. The stock market grew by almost 16 times during this period, adjusted for inflation and including dividends. The US GDP also expanded by roughly 300% during this period. While there are many factors that have influenced such growth rates over these periods, my intention here is to simply state that perhaps high taxes are not the economic poison that they have been marketed as being. We can think about taxes, especially corporate taxes, the same way we treat environmental and labor regulations. There is an attempt to ensure that countries maintain environmental standards. The efficacy is debatable, but the principle is sound. More effective has been labor regulations, whereby countries may refuse to import or trade products that have been made with child labor or forced labor. So in the same way that we have global standards for labor and the environment, we should have a global standard for corporate taxes, so it's not a race to the bottom. so companies cannot flee to a low-tax jurisdiction when taxes are raised. The global minimum tax aims to do just that, but with a rate of 15%, there's a long way to go. Conclusion. Unfortunately, money is power, and accumulation of money means the accumulation of power. The power to write the very laws that keep taxes low and exacerbate inequality. There is nothing wrong with value exchange. We exchange our labor for money. People throughout history have bartered goods. The problem is exploitative value extraction, enabled by an asymmetric power dynamic. In this dynamic, usually the employer will have all the power, and we will see the consequences of this play out in real life. To reiterate, asymmetry in power leads to exploitation and imbalance in value exchanged. And as capital pools to the top, I wonder, what will the world look like? And perhaps more importantly, what do we want the world to look like?